Hey y'all, it's Asha Bookishrealm and I am back with another video. As you can see by the title of this video, I'm talking a little bit about what it means to be a booktuber versus a librarian, which I think is pretty interesting because I'm both. And I often get questions from booktubers and from other librarians on how I manage to make my way between both worlds. So I don't really have all of the answers here. I think that everyone's experiences are going to be completely different. So this is just my experience as a booktuber and a librarian. It doesn't necessarily mean that anybody else out there that is a booktuber and a librarian have the same experience as me. So yes, plus my position kind of makes things a little bit interesting. So if you don't know, which at this point I don't know how you don't know, because I mean it's something that I talk about very frequently. I am a librarian. Spirit fingers. But yes, so I am a librarian. I specifically work in collection development, collection management, however you want to coin that. I won't get into the specifics of my job. I never say where I work, specifically what I do. I answer as many questions as I can without revealing too much information. That's just called boundaries, and we love to have boundaries. So I actually was a booktuber before I became a librarian, but I was not a consistent booktuber before I became a librarian. I actually didn't really start consistently doing booktube until I was about 2 years into my profession. So one of the things, probably one of the most obvious things that is different between booktubers and librarians is the whole conversation about access. So I know that a lot of people have a tendency to disagree with me on this, and this is something that I talk about frequently, and that's that whole like let's make lists about people that we should not be reading books from. I literally cannot work in that frame of mind because I am a librarian. So it's very hard to sometimes differentiate between what my personal feelings are and what my professional feelings have to be. So I can say that I don't want to read a specific author, a specific series because of behavior, etc., but I cannot bring those personal feelings into my job. It is a very interesting kind of relationship to have there, like keeping your feelings in check, which I think if you're just one or the other, it's not as much of a difficult balance per se. So because of that, I'm very, very mindful about how I present certain things on this channel. And I think it's because that philosophy, that ideology kind of bleeds a little bit into my channel. So you'll hear me say things like, I didn't like this book. I can't recommend it, but that shouldn't stop you from reading it, or if you want to pick it up, I'm not here to judge you for picking said book up or reading said author or whatever. It becomes habit to keep your personal beliefs out of it. I think that as a librarian compared to being a booktuber, in my role that I have now, I think that my reading has to be a little bit more expansive than if I was just solely a booktuber. Not saying that booktubers don't have range. Not saying that, because somebody's going to take that out of context. But I think that I definitely have to do it a little bit more frequently. I don't have any sense of like specialty. It's hard to have a specialty or to like hyper focus on SFF or to hyper focus da. Now I do have my own personal preferences, but I think that because of the job that I'm in now, I am kind of pushing out a little bit from those personal preferences because I have to be more knowledgeable of what's coming out. Now, speaking of what's coming out, Booktube is a very interesting community because I think that we are a lot smaller than we realize. We're a lot more insular than we realize, and we are not a good representation of the entire reading community on and off this platform at large. So what is often popular on Booktube is not popular per se in the real world. I'm not saying that Booktube is in the real world, but just like in the larger global reading community, it does not necessarily mean that it's going to be popular. So I can see something that's like booming on Booktube, and then I can see that same thing in the library and it gets no circulation. So that is very interesting. I also think that there are opportunities to pay more attention to things that don't get as much marketing from these publishing companies. So we dive a little bit deeper into stuff than I think sometimes Booktube does in terms of new releases. I think a lot of times when we talk about new releases, it's a lot of stuff that's received a lot of hype and a lot of push from publishers, or it's gotten a lot of buzz. Not to say that those things don't get purchased for libraries or they don't end up having like a decent like holds list or circulation numbers, but I think that in a lot of cases it does go beyond that. Like, you have to be pretty aware of a lot of different things coming out, a wide variety of things. You can't just focus on the things that get a lot of buzz or have gotten a lot of push from these marketing departments within publishing houses. So you can't rely so much on that. Now, what is interesting is that I do feel like Booktube gives me kind of a little bit of an edge. And what I mean by that is that I think that I am a little bit more prepared for what some trends may be looking like than if I wasn't a part of Booktube. Does it always mean that it's going to inform my job? Not necessarily, but I think it does help in some cases. I think that Book Talk actually is going to be a bigger influence in Booktube, which is really interesting. I'm sort of kind of in Book Talk, but it's just so much social media stuff. It's just a lot to keep up with. But Book Talk is influencing some aspects of my job. Booktube probably not so much, and I think because Book Talk is definitely easier in terms of the speed at which information is processed, whereas on Booktube, you know, of course, videos are longer. It takes a little bit longer to consume that stuff. So not saying that I believe that one is better than the other. I think just the formats lend to different results. So sometimes Booktube itself does help me gain a little bit of an edge, or it has actually helped me be able to review things before. It's helped me make more informed purchase decisions. So like when I say that, you know, as booktubers, sometimes we do get access to review titles and stuff like that, and it does help. But then I also think that as a librarian and working with sites like Advocacy, I actually have a one up because on Advocacy I have not gotten denied for anything. It's kind of like an instantaneous access type of situation for librarians, which may not be the same for those who are just social media influencers. So I think that that element of it is very interesting, that in terms of getting like arcs and stuff like that, while I think I'm more likely to get a physical arc as a booktuber or like social media influencer, I am more likely to get instantaneously approved for anything that I want if it's a digital request. So they're very different aspects of my life, and it's interesting that they are so heavily different from each other because they both involve books, but they involve books in different capacities. And I think that it's always been pretty interesting for me to essentially like look at how I function in one circle as opposed to, you know, another. I think that Booktube has definitely helped me, you know, build that base of being I don't want to call myself a well-read individual. I feel like that's kind of pompous of me to say something like that, but it has created such a base for me, and it is a community in the past that has really motivated me to like read and consume a lot of material. I think that Booktube actually does push me to read more than if I was just a librarian. Even by librarian standards, I read a whole lot. Like a whole lot, but I think because of the nature of Booktube, and I'm not saying like competitive, but I think that the rate at which we read also helps us balance the amount of content that we're able to put out. Like, we are in one of those niche type of hobbies where, like, if you don't read, it doesn't mean that you can't come up with content, but it's like a little bit more difficult to come up with content. So you are constantly consuming stuff, and it helps with population of content. Whereas, you know, as a librarian, it's not necessarily the case. Like, you are reading stuff because you want to keep up with what's going on in publishing. You know, you may want to review something or check something out or whatever the case may be. But I think that because of the way that Booktube functions, you're going to find people who read a heck of a lot more than those who actually work in libraries. Now, we do look at reviews a little bit differently. I think that when you are a booktuber, I think we rely heavily on each other for reviews, and we heavily look at Storygraph and Goodreads. Well, in my profession, those are not reliable resources 100% of the time. So we look for actual, like, journals. So like Kirkus Reviews is a big one that we use in order to, you know, really look at, like, I don't want to say certified reviews is not, but like professional reviews. So like Kirkus Reviews, Publishers Weekly, School Library Journal, Book List, Library Journal. Those are places where we are definitely looking to see whether a book is a good fit for a collection or not. We're not going to necessarily depend upon Goodreads and say like, oh yeah, well, this random person said that this book was good, so we're going to take their word for it. Like, that, unfortunately, that's just not the way that it works. Whereas I think on the Booktube side of things, I don't know how many people in Booktube are actually familiar with these professional review places like Kirkus Reviews, Publishers Weekly. I think a lot of people are probably familiar with Publishers Weekly, but like School Library Journal, Library Journal, like I highly doubt that there are many people in the book community who actually read those journals actively, like the way that a librarian would actively read those journals. So I think that that's interesting, because I often see like something that will get like rave reviews within like the Booktube community, and I'll see a professional review that's like, yeah, this just wasn't it. And of course, I mean, they don't say stuff like that. It's definitely written in a more professional manner. But that's why I said it's fascinating, because we do really, as Booktubers, live in a huge bubble. Whereas like when you step outside of that bubble and you are in still like a reading environment, an environment that's focused on literacy. Actually, I'm going to stop myself right there and say that that's another huge difference, is that librarianship is about not all of it, but I think a huge component of librarianship is, you know, not only about access, but literacy. And I don't think that that component is necessarily incorporated into Booktube. I think sometimes as Booktubers, we don't realize the privilege that we have to even be literate. Whereas in librarians, we do recognize that that is a privilege, and that there are some barriers for individuals to, you know, not really have access to those basic literacy skills that they need to function from day to day. So I think that there's a little bit more advocacy work that goes on in librarianship than you would see on Booktube. I think Booktube really is about, you know, expressing your passion for reading and, you know, talking about these books, giving recommendations, reviewing books, having these in-depth conversations that may be related to the community. But I have yet to really see someone have a conversation about literacy and Booktube and literacy. Maybe that's something that I will tackle, but it is a very interesting thing to see as a librarian, knowing that literacy, especially when I have specifically spent most of my career working with youth, that literacy is a huge component of what I've been doing. It's extremely important, extremely important. And that's probably why as a librarian, I always feel like it's interesting when I don't see as many people really talk about like children's books or picture books. Like middle grade, I think gets some heavy play because it's not too far removed from YA, but I think that like picture books and children's books don't get as much play, which is interesting because picture books, beginner readers, board books are the foundations for literacy, and they don't get as much play, which is why I think that literacy is not really a component that many people necessarily think about when they're involved in the Booktube environment. So I really do feel like it's something that should be, I don't want to say analyzed, because analyze is not a good word, but I think that it's really something that should be considered when we talk about Booktube as a community, to realize that Booktube is not representative, and that includes Bookstagram, Book Talk, and Book Twitter. They're not representative of people who are part of a larger reading community. This is very much so narrowed itself down to the reading community within the realm of social media, and it is not indicative of what other people are doing outside of social media. It's not always indicative of trends that happen outside of social media. I think that we're starting, like I said before, we're starting to see a little bit more alignment with like Book Talk and some of these trends, because that's the new thing right now. I don't know how long that will last before the next social media platform comes along, and we have to find a new way to integrate ourselves into that. But I am a firm believer that this is not all that exists. Those social media platforms, this social media platform, Booktube as a community, it's not an equal representation, and that while reading may be a commonality between different groups, I think that there are different expectations and goals when you step outside of Booktube. And definitely as a librarian, I have different expectations and goals that I wouldn't necessarily have as a booktuber. Like I said, that literacy component, that access conversation, and not telling people like you shouldn't read these authors, or it is completely different, and not in a good or a bad way. They're just two different things. But I do believe that because I am such a part of both worlds, that it gives me such a unique perspective, and I think it's been beneficial to me in both arenas. I think in the Booktube community, librarianship is something that people are curious about and they want to know more about, and it's a different lens that I bring to the table whenever we have our community discussions or group discussions. I always look at things through the lens of a librarian, because it is so different than just looking at things through the lens of a booktuber. And sometimes when I am working, it sometimes helps that I can see things through the lens of a booktuber, or being a part of Book Talk, or whatever the case may be, because it can help me kind of gain a little bit more insight than what I would have had if I wasn't a part of this community. It's allowed me to build some really, really great relationships with some publishers. That's not to say that I couldn't have those relationships with publishers as just a librarian, but I think the twofold aspect of it has really given me some special connections with some people, and has allowed me to build some relationships that, like I said, I don't know would necessarily exist without it. But I just wanted to kind of sit down and talk about this. I know that I have said that I wanted to do I wanted to do a library Q&A, which is still the plan to do that. I just have not had the time to sit down and kind of compile all the questions, because let's be honest, I'm not going to be able to really I'm probably not gonna be able to answer all of the questions, but I do want to make sure that I'm answering as many unique questions as I get, because some of them were kind of duplicates. So if you have any questions, specific questions that you would like to ask me, let me know in the comment box below, and that video should be coming soon. I really want to go back to start doing a little bit more library-based content. I'm hoping that I can kind of make that happen sooner than later. But I just wanted to give y'all kind of a taste of like the difference between the two and how it can be similar and why being a part of both communities is super beneficial to me. But as always, if you like this video, make sure you give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more content from me, click the subscribe button, hit that bell for notification. Interested in following me on social media or supporting this channel, all the links will be down in the description box below, and I will be back with another video soon. I promise y'all I'm gonna get back on my game. I know I had just filmed that I'm not really feeling the book community, but I want to do this for me. So yeah, with that being said, toodles.